Alors, tu peux le mettre là.
Good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, which is the time we're supposed to start. So the food and drink is very nice, but I would ask you to settle down now so we can have the program and return to the food and drink afterwards. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Siam Society and also the École Française, let me welcome you to this evening. My name is Chris Baker, and I'm a member of the Siam Society. This is a lovely event to honor Damian Evans. Damian came to speak here, I think in 2016. I can't remember quite what year. And at that time he was still not yet, and his work was still not yet very well known. and he gave a presentation in the room upstairs to an audience of about 30 people. And I only went because someone from ANU, where he was, said, "You have to go, because this guy is so good." And he gave, and because, you know, when we were there, we had no idea what we know now about his work. This was the first introduction to what he was doing, still in a rather crude way with lidar. It was just mind-blowing at that point, of how this would change the whole business of archaeology and the whole perception of Angkor. So it was wonderful. And I had about 5 minutes afterwards with him upstairs somewhere, trying to persuade him to come and, you know, use this technology in Ayutthaya. But unfortunately, he was waylaid by Tanpuying Putri, who has much more social power than I have, so I got nowhere. So anyway, it was good. So we have we have 4 papers tonight. Each is going to speak for about 15 minutes. We will delay the questions to the end. We'll have the 4 papers first, and if you have questions, please keep them until the end. And that is about it. I'm not going to read out the bios of these people, because they're all very famous people, and you can read them elsewhere. I would just like to ask Christophe Potier to please come up and give the first of the papers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just let me find some time to find my PowerPoint. Where is it? Yes. Yes. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Chris, for this introduction words. Thanks again for the Siam Society and the FEO to host us for this symposium tonight. May I just say a few words about these symposiums? And somehow we actually took the opportunity of the SPAFA conference, which was going on, which is still going on in Bangkok these days, and to take the opportunity of having so many archaeologists and historians and people of the field present here in Bangkok tonight to organize this small series of talks as a kind of a present to our colleague Damian Evans, who actually passed away last September in Paris. So as Chris told, actually Damian had the opportunity to give a lecture in these walls, or in 2016 actually, just before actually we were involved into a lidar survey in Phnom Rung at that time with the Fine Arts Department. But anyway, we organized this talk tonight with 5 different short talks, so I will try myself to be short, despite I have quite a number of slides to go on. And my talk today will be mostly a kind of reminder, a kind of introductory thing about the mapping Angkor, as actually mapping Angkor was the subject of the PhD of Damian, and actually it happens, and it was also my PhD subject. So mapping is something which make Damian and I to meet and to work together for about 25 years. And of course, the mapping in Angkor didn't really start with Damian. It didn't even start with me either. It has a much longer story, starting somewhere in the 19th century with the first Westerners explorers. I would even recall a Japanese map of Angkor from the 17th century. But anyway, putting Angkor on the map was a way to understand and to see Angkor, to understand Angkor. It started at the beginning of the 20th century with various inventory campaigns, which were developed later on and centralized on the Angkor region as soon as the EFEO established a permanent center there, the Conservation d'Angkor. Here we have a map from 1911, centered over the main structures, which were later developed in the 30s and 40s, and later on in the 70s with the seminal work of Bernard-Philippe Grolier on the hydraulic city of Angkor. As you can see, the map was still restricted to the central part of Angkor, monumental temples and monumental hydraulic infrastructures. Actually, the work started to evolve a little bit in the early 90s when the site reopened with the zoning environmental management plan, which was developed under the auspice of the UNESCO and UNDP at that time, for which I was involved. And we started to map the whole region of Angkor and starting to identify new numbers of sites. And actually, that was the subject of my PhD in the 90s, concentrated at that time on only 600 square kilometers in the central zone, which was safe enough. And actually, when Damian came into the picture in the late 90s, in the framework of an international project initiated by Professor Roland Fletcher from Sydney University, involving University of Sydney, Apsara National Authority, and the EFEO, one of the tasks was to develop this mapping to the remaining parts, especially to the northern part, and that's what actually Damian was involved in. And actually started to develop the northern part, then extending it further to the whole watersheds, identifying hundreds of new structures on this remote, largely unknown area. Actually, the work of Damian Evans at that time and his contribution as a PhD was not only the extension, the geographic extension, but it was also to bring mapping, archaeological mapping, into a new dimension, into the digital dimension. Previously, the mapping, actually that's where mines in the 90s were made by hand on ink, on tracing paper, like old-fashioned stuff, 19th century, 20th century. So that was nice, but, and it was of course associated with databases. But with the development in the 90s of GIS, Geographic Information Systems, Damian has been crucial into integrating all these data into GIS. GIS integrating ancient maps, up-to-date maps, new mapping, all documents related, different kind of remote sensing pictures, including radar at that time, not lidar yet, but radar. And these were actually a key element on the methodology applied during his PhD to identify not only temples, but mounds, ponds, linear structures, canals, roads, ancient rice fields, and so on. And that was associated with a database which allowed us to move from this very handmade analog way of doing with a post-it on the map to a completely integrated notepad tool. And Damian was very proud of that at that time, even if actually the notepad was very black and very small. We cannot really see anything, especially under the sun. But he was very proud, and he has been not only mapping in front of a computer, but he spent years of various campaigns walking in the rice fields, identifying, spotting the remains of this ancient vestige through a large landscape over 1,000 square kilometers. So most of the time it was just mounds with vegetation. Unfortunately, many times also looted sites where we could identify broken bricks, fragments of stones, and so on, remains of quite modest temples and villages. And all that was integrated into a register, which is still used today, which is very handy because it's integrate different inventories and different numbering of sites, which has been developed by different researchers for over a century. And all that work actually was finished somewhere in 2007 when Damian finished his PhD. And at that time, we were then able to publish this first map of the whole Greater Angkor over 1,000 square kilometers. And it was labeled as a bit sexy titling, like the most largest pre-industrial settlement complex in the world. And that was a very nice title, which attracted a lot of traction. And after that, actually, Damian developed further projects on various regional settlements, and our colleagues will later on speak about that. But there was still a problem on that map, and the problem was that the vegetation was still actually hiding many remains at the central part of Angkor and other areas which were heavily forested. And our methodology was relying largely on remote sensing. And fortunately, in 2010, there was what we can call like a lidar revolution, the introduction of a new technology called lidar to archaeology, which was originally introduced in the Maya world in Belize by some American colleagues, the Chasers, who published a very interesting paper at that time showing how the lidar can be used to see under the vegetation, revealing huge number of settlements which were hidden by the vegetation. And it happened that at that time, our colleague Roland Fletcher and myself were in Belize with the Chase when they just published the paper. The Star Wars ship is a Photoshop, okay. But anyway, we were in Tikal at that time, and of course, we were very keen to get that technology to be used in Angkor. And then Damian Evans has been crucial, and he was the architect who made it possible. Actually, the lidar has this capacity, more or less, to see through the vegetation. In fact, that capacity makes it very handy for archaeology. But just to go very quickly into the techniques, actually, the lidar doesn't go through anything, of course. It doesn't go through the ground, through the water, or whatever. It's just passing in the holes in the forest. So if you are in the forest and you see pieces of the sky, that means then there will be some holes enough for the laser points to come to the ground. And that's enough actually to record billions of points and then to play with the computer and algorithm to classify and sort out what actually archaeologists need, which is the ground points, which enabled us to create digital elevation models of the terrain and the fine topography of large areas. So through an international consortium of 8 international teams in 2012, we were able to launch a first campaign of lidar acquisition over Angkor mostly, and actually Damian Evans was the key architect behind that project. Fortunately enough, he was able to extend that program through a European Research Council grant in 2015, which was hosted by the EFEO, over more provincial sites, over 2,000 square kilometers. Later on, Damian and I were called by our Thai colleague to advise them for lidar coverage made in Phnom Rung and Plai Bat in 2016. Over 100 square kilometers. Since then, this technology has been applied on an even larger area, especially, for instance, in Wat Phu, Champasak province, where we covered around 4,000 square kilometers, and Damian was in charge of this acquisition in 2021. Yes. Since then, also, we have been using different tools, different methodologies using UAV and drones lidar, which prove very effective for much smaller areas. So there is a kind of flexibility behind this technology, which help us to use it on very different sites. I just take the opportunity to mention how we were able, with the project designed and directed by Damian, to conduct a new series of acquisition in Southeast Asia. We just finished actually last week an acquisition over Sukhothai, Kampengphet, and Sisa Chanalai, and we are planning further lidar coverage also elsewhere in Southeast Asia in the close future, with different solutions depending the different areas. I will just finish with a couple of pictures showing you some of the results, and my friends later on will show you also other results of this methodology introduced by Damian. But I will concentrate here in the central part of Angkor. As you know, Angkor Thom and Angkor Wat. Let's zoom on this part, which are heavily forested on the classic satellite picture. This is a classic pre-lidar mapping. As we can see, there are enclosures, but they are a little bit empty around there. Various fieldworks made by various colleagues, including our nephew researcher named Jacques Gaucher, for years in the forest, slowly identify a series of grids and roads and so on inside Angkor Thom. In fact, the lidar just did the same, even more precise, in a couple of hours of flight. Not only concentrating on inside the wall, but also showing concentration of mounds outside of this thing. So we move from a mapping which go from this to this, which clearly shows a very serious difference of perception of the density of population and density of occupation, which was happening in central part of Angkor. Let's move to Angkor Wat, which is actually, which was also the most famous monument, supposed to be well known. Actually, clearly also inside the enclosure of Angkor Wat, there is a series of mounds and ponds and alignments which suggest a nice pattern of settlements right next to the temple, and which help us to build this kind of visualization of Angkor 800 years ago. Finally, these maps actually with the lidar moved from this, which was a 2007, to this one, which is 2015, and it's still going on. So there is a very different idea and different perception of the concentration of settlements. But of course, as my title of my short presentation was about, it's going from analog to digital and from digital to analog, because beside these nice digital tools and these clouds of points on a computer, actually there is a lot of field work involved behind, a lot of field verifications, on which actually Damian also spent years doing in the field, finding new sites, sometimes in very difficult accessibility and difficult environments, sometimes finding just piece of sherds on the ground, no monumental remains actually. And of course, many traces of looting, unfortunately. With the field work came also the training, and the training of local archaeologists. Here, with the case here is in Thailand, but it's also happening in Cambodia, where there were training sessions to help our colleagues actually to be able to use and make use of these digital means and using the lidar for this heritage management. And nowadays it's still going on. These tools also have been very effective for dissemination over a large public. It's a perfect digital tool which help to make people understand about the importance of heritage. And of course, another aspect was the media coverage behind these discoveries. And for that also, Damian was very good at making things samples and easily understandable in front of a camera. So finally, I will just finish my already too long talk with just a few slides to show the recent development and to show also that these kind of tools are not only a magic and a handy toy for archaeologists, but they can be a very useful data sets for many other services and departments and authorities, because it can be used also for land use management, flood risk mapping, forestry department, and so on. Actually, this kind of very precise data have a number of uses which go much beyond archaeology. And the recent development, which were initiated by Damian, and then we are still developing, is actually moving this digital data into the world of artificial intelligence, AI, and machine learning, which hopefully will help us and help archaeologists also to identify these archaeological features into the middle of terabytes of and billions of points, which actually take years actually to draw and to be identified. So hopefully AI will help us on that issue. Thank you very much. I was already too long. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Christophe. May I remind you, we will have questions at the end. The second talk is by Per Pacharaporn, who is a PhD candidate at Silpakorn University here in Bangkok. Per.
Good evening, everyone. Today, I would like to talk about the topic of the settlement pattern and the urban form during the 7th to the 11th century CE in eastern Thailand. That is, some features show the relationship of the ancient Khmer and Thawaravadi culture. First of all, I will start with the overview about the archaeological study in eastern Thailand that located between the central Thailand and western Cambodia. The previous study of the aerial photo interpretation showed the various features about the man-made earthwork, and one of them is the mosaic in many various forms, such as the rectangular form, the circle, and square. And the key sites in this region is including of the Simahosot in Prachinburi province and Mueang Parot in Chonburi province at the western part of the region. At the south is the Phaniat in Chantaburi province, and the last one is the Mueang Pai in Sakeo province in the hinterland. For the archaeological evidence, they indicate the style of the sculpture and architecture influenced from Thawaravadi culture that is called should be assumed in the central plain of the Thailand. And the another is come from the ancient Khmer of the Cambodia and southern Vietnam. And the inscription told us about the state formation of eastern Thailand should be formed since at least the 6th century CE. In details, the sculpture in the black frame were found in the 4 mosaics, and most of them appear the style of the Pyongyorian in the 7th century AD that's related with Hinduism, but we also found the sculpture built in the Buddhism in the western part of the region, such as the Simahosot and Mueang Parot in Chonburi province. And they are very similar to the Thawaravadi culture in the 8th to the 9th century CE. So the diagnostic artifacts, as I mentioned, they point out the hybridity of the style and the ratio that we can see generally in eastern Thailand as the interface region between Thawaravadi and ancient Khmer. And moreover, some peers can be identified as the local style of this region, like some features of the landscape that show the circle pond or the square pond that discovered in the western part of the region is located from the north from Simahosot to the south at Parot in Chonburi. And I think the process of localization is what depends on the cultural expansion through the political power of the core state in each time. So, if you understand the context of the archaeological data in eastern Thailand, you may note that the role of the landscape should be related with the character of this region as the frontier. The question about the settlement pattern and its archaeological relation are focused in this talk. I need to know how is the settlement pattern in eastern Thailand when the sites were urbanized into the most sites, and what about the relationship between the settlement pattern and urban form. For methodology, I apply the geological and remote sensing data in terms of the spatial analysis through the GIS process to reconstruct the archaeological landscape in the past, and it showed the implication of the urban form reflecting in the settlement pattern during the 7th to 11th century CE in this region. Again, the methods which I use to my work are related with the remote sensing and spatial analysis. Many datasets of remote sensing include of the digital elevation model, aerial photo from the Royal Thai Survey, and satellite imagery of the landscape from USGS and Google Earth. They are interpreted by the Miller stereoscope and GIS software. They reveal the archaeological and geomorphological features such as the mound, linear, channel, and pond in the study area. After the interpretation, the result will be process of the mapping with the archaeological site, which I collect them from the ground survey and the previous study from the Fine Art Department of Thailand. Then they will be analyzed to looking for the relationship between the archaeological features, especially the most sites, and the landscape under the spatial process of the site hierarchy that consider the site shape, and site density. And list cost path analysis that it reveals the distance between the points. Next is the result will be discussed from now on. They will show the implication of the site hierarchy and list cost path analysis of the most sites in eastern Thailand in the views of the association of the urban form and the settlement pattern. Site hierarchy indicates the 3 rankings of the most sites based on size and shape, and the urban form is also interesting. The first ranking I call this group as the central towns, which are include of the 4 key sites, include of the Simohosot, Parot, Paniet, and Muang Pai. We can observe the shape as the rounded corner rectangle or the almost rectangle. Predominantly, the channel is the way appear in the central area in the mode along with the complexity of the plan. And the second ranking is called as the sub-town. They are as complex as the first group, but they are smaller. And they show the expanded part in the irregular shape from the innermost side from the area. And we found about the 3 most sites in this region. And the last group is the smallest size, and they are mostly discovered in eastern Thailand, that I would call them as the village or the sub-district. They are viewed in the oval, square, and circular shape. Moreover, the distribution of this cluster are surrounding the central town and the sub-town, which I present you in previous slide. So, the site hierarchy of the most sites in eastern Thailand is concluded to the 3 rankings, that the chart of size distribution on this slide show the most sites of this region are smaller than other regions, but it's close to the group of the central Thailand that we assume that is the core of the Thawaravadi kingdom. Although the most sites are observed as the urban form, but the other features are still derived from the aerial photo interpretation, especially the linear features surrounding the most sites. When I compare these linear features with the major light field system of the Angkor, It's very similar in the pattern, that it composed of the strand earthwork and small channel linking to the pond together with the building and the pond in the systematic plan. That we found this pattern, especially in the eastern part of the region that's covered on the Sakao province. In contrast to the western part, such as the Mueang Donglakon and Simahosot, linear features are less changed in the pattern. That I think it implies the difference of the culture, political system, or even the difference in the topography. So the urban center of the eastern Thailand was consist of the three main features that consist of the mosaic, monument, and pond. Anyway, the inscription and archaeological evidence suggest the eastern part of the region was extremely influenced from the ancient Khmer culture in the 7th century CE until the expansion of the King Surya Varman I from Angkor. I think the eastern Thailand may be also completely covered during the 10 to 11. And so we can see some feature of the landscape under the ancient Khmer culture in this region. Another result is the model of least cost path analysis. I process the model for showing the routes that the people can travel from a central town to the another by avoiding high elevation. And I think the liberalized routes should be focused as a part of the connection to the overland route. The model shows the main routes are connect from the Simahosot to Mueang Pai in east-west orientation, predominantly as the urban center of this region. This is supported by the site density that cluster in the foremost site located in each local area. You can see the cluster at Simahosot as the highest density, and right is shared along with the border of the flat plate that related with the provincial line in the 3,000 years ago. And next to the hinterland in Sakao province, the density is lower slightly in the center of the region and lie up again at the zone of the Mueang Pai. In contrast to the Paniat at the Chanthaburi in the south of the region, it is the only cluster that far from others, so I keep it as the isolated town. As I have presented you about the site hierarchy, you will see the 4 urban centers were classified to the first ranking of the hierarchy as the central towns. We can note the urban as the loudest corner rectangle or almost rectangle, and the appearance of the canal running into the inner area is obvious character. These forms are similar to the big town of Tawarawadi culture in central Thailand, such as the Udhong, Kubua, and Nakhon Pathom. And it's similar to the culture of the Angkorian, such as the Sombo Paikuk and Angkor. And you can see the plan of Paniat at Chanthaburi is very similar to the Sombo Paikuk of Angkor. Moreover, the central towns are loaded by the mosaic of lower ranking, including the sub-town and village in the buffer of the 10 to 40 kilometers. You can see these sites located on the overland route between the central towns. So I think this network may relate to administration of the states, that it could be influenced from the expansion of Tawarawadi and ancient Khmer kingdoms in this time, that Eastern Thailand located between them as the buffer zone. Let's turn to the urban form. The most sides of the lower ranking are dominant in the circle and the rounded corner square. And they are smaller as well as showing the expanded part. I realize this group like the small mosaic of Tawarawadi culture, such as the Mueang Chan Sen, Mueang Kamphaeng Sen, Mueang Khu Mueang, and innermost side of the Mueang Bon in Nakhon Sawan province. So It is possible that the urban form can imply to the function or the status of the town, because when I consider the relationship between the settlement pattern and urban form in eastern Thailand and its surrounding, I detect the form of the rectangle or almost rectangle should be related with being the regional center of the state as the inner trading post or the gateway as a hub of communication. In contrast to the shape of the circle or oval square form, it may represent the village or the sub-district at the administration level that they were established to ring the network between regional center. My assumption is derived from the spatial analysis in this work. This site density and archaeological data suggest that the foremost sites as the center towns should be the regional center of the state in eastern Thailand. Together with the model of the list cost path analysis points out the Simahosot and Khmer Empire might be the center of communication between Tawarodi in the west and ancient Khmer in the east, that other towns were established as a part of this political or economic network. In conclusion, the results of this work, including the site hierarchy and the risk cost path analysis, indicate the three rankings of the most sites in eastern Thailand, and the center town should be the urban center in each local area. They suggest the relationship between the settlement pattern and the urban form in eastern Thailand, obviously, that the center town is showing in the rectangular or the almost rectangular plan as the regional center. Significantly, I think the urban form should be contribute to study the cultural transition through the process of the Indianization and localization in the early historical period in South Asia for further work. Thank you for your attention.
This is amazingly important work. For the last 30 years, our understanding of early Southeast Asia, and particularly mainland South, has been restricted because the amount of digging has been very small and has been restricted by the number of people who want to do it, but also by the fine arts department, who is sometimes very nervous about allowing people to do this. But now, instead of going underground, we go up in the air, and you can learn even more, which is absolutely wonderful. Per, thank you very much. The third speaker is Jean-Baptiste Chirance, who is just flown in, I think. So please.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Oops. Okay. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Siam Society and the AFIO for inviting me tonight. So let's start. From the 14th of June 2013, 11 years ago to the date, and about a year, a media storm hit Damian Evans and myself after the release of a press article entitled The Lost City, in reference to the early Khmer 9th century capital of Mahendra Parvata, laying on the Phnom Kulen Plateau 40 kilometers northeast of Angkor. This was following an academic paper presenting the discoveries of the first lidar campaign in Cambodia, organized by Damian within the Khmer Archaeology lidar consortium with 8 international teams, and covering Angkor, Khokher, and a part of Phnom Kulen. The first journalist that Damian and I took in Phnom Kulen partially depicted this study, focusing on Phnom Kulen in sensational terms, illustrating it with a picture of us walking towards the temple known since 1932, belonging to this so-called lost city. Within a few days, I was contacted by 50 different media, was on live interviews, made the front page of The World, and had a dozen of documentary propositions. Again, the published articles were using pictures of later and non-related sites in Phnom Kulen, or pictures of the main temple in Angkor. Issuing press releases, and under continuous pressure, we were attempting desperately to explain the subtleties of this discovery to the larger public. I must say that after completing a master's degree in 2005 on the temples of this capital, and implementing since 2008 a research and conservation project in Phnom Kulen in partnership with the Cambodian Apsara Authority, I was in a quite delicate situation. Quoting here Damian, this is the list I had to make for the media contacting me. Quoting here Damian from a paper published 5 months later in The Diplomat, story after story continued to channel the colonial fantasy of an exotic civilization lost and found, drawing all of us alarmingly deeper into the perilous terrain where archaeology, politics, identity, and memory all collide. In the center of that media attention, only one newspaper dared to challenge the myth with a lost city not so lost after all. And later on, very few of others tried to understand the broad context and the details of this discovery. Again, quoting Damian, in spite of this, months later, the sensational narrative simply refuses to die, and it remains a source of considerable frustration and unease for myself and for several of my colleagues. In this online article, Damian tried to lay out a sober and thoughtful case for the broader significance of our research. To add on this, Phnom Kulen and its capital were already often caricatured as the birthplace of the Angkorian civilization. The famous mid-centuries Dokak Tom inscription took over other epigraphical sources and became a convenient reference point. It carved into marble the date of 802 AD between the convenient but arbitrary pre-Angkorian and Angkorian periods, while Jayaraman II proclaimed himself universal sovereign at Mahendraparvata, establishing the Devaraja cult and freeing himself from the tutelage of another state. This historical shortcut will not be discussed today, but rather the successive periods of research that allow to build and eventually deconstruct this caricature, as well as debunking the even more irrational myth of a lost city, known for almost a century. Here, we will endeavor to reinforce this message on the light of this past decade of research, and of course in memory of our regretted and talented colleague and friend. To do this, we must delve into the historiography and present here, if I may say so, the different layers of knowledge that have been over a century of research accumulated on this so-called lost city. Phnom Kulen, the main geological feature in the region, is geographically, hydrologically, and historically linked to the Angkor capital. It is isolated and quite difficult to access, and its exploration took place intermittently throughout the late century until the 1960s. Taking place in the French colonial context of the late 19th and early 20th century, archaeological expedition gave rise to inventories and publications placing sites, mostly temples, on maps across the Khmer Empire territory, and the Kulen Plateau being logically integrated into this dynamic. As studies of Khmer history were in their infancy, these sites could not be placed in their context. In the 1910s, Mahendraparvata was identified with a massive, thanks to other inscriptions, again later than the capital. However, the chronology of the Khmer monument and style was not properly established, with the Bayon style monument attributed to the 9th century, and the brick towers of Phnom Kulen could not properly fit in. It is only in the 20s and 30s of last century that, with the combined work of Georges Cédès on the epigraphical source and the studies from Philippe Stearns on the architectural decoration and sculpture and the definition of the Kulen style, that Phnom Kulen temples were finally attributed to the late 8th century and early 9th century, a period corresponding to the reign of Jayaraman II. The consecration of this hypothesis is made during Stern archaeological mission from 1936 to 1938, studying mainly the sculpted sandstone element of this monument. However, it will provide a first archaeological map of the massif. Later, Angkor attracted most of the attention of the researcher, and the region remained largely unexplored until the 1960s with the work of Jean Boulbet, anthropologist and botanist from the FEO, studying ancient and modern anthropogenic transformation and thus completing the archaeological map. As part of a UNESCO project, the work of the Danish architect Erik Hansen on hydraulic structure should also be mentioned here. After the Civil War, the rebirth of the Khmer studies combined with the new technologies such as remote sensing allowed the map of the Angkorian landscape, and Christophe Potier, followed by Damian Evans' pioneer work, redefine our vision of the Angkorian settlements away from the main monuments. At that time, and despite their importance within the Khmer Empire history, Phnom Kulen and the remains of Mahendra Parvata remained an underestimated area. The late presence of Khmer Rouge and the dense forest did not, it is true, offer the best context for venturing there. After our master degree that I was mentioning earlier, in 2005, we were able to set up the Archaeology and Development Foundation, embracing all listed and newly discovered archaeological sites on the plateau with the objective of defining their chronological and spatial relation. Our surveys and excavation reveal not only a typology of sites, but also a first overall organization, albeit partial, of this capital. These studies, accompanied by an updated map, were brought together in a PhD thesis defended in 2011, a year before the first lidar acquisition, and 2 years before the alleged discovery of the lost city. At the time, and from 2008 already, we had already excavated more than a dozen of sites, including 3 campaigns at Bantay, leading to its identification as the royal palace of this capital, its mountain temple, spatially linked to the palace, as well as 7 other temples, most of them testifying that their construction and occupation were contemporary with the reign of Charlemagne II. The numerous hermit rock shelters also caught our attention, and our work redefined their presence on the plateau from the 10th to the 13th century. Despite the presence of this marker of a capital, the forest cover and the irregular topography prevented us to identify the missing element of a Khmer capital, its main reservoir, and perhaps above all, the landscape modification linked to the installation of its population. In addition, the major dikes creating large reservoirs could not be yet linked with certainty to this capital. And this is where the LiDAR came, first in 2012, in yellow on this map, and then in 2015. The 2012 acquisition area in Kulen certainly corresponded to the ADF budget, but was also defined by the presence of the main sites, the Royal Palace to the west, the most eastern dike, and temples to the northern and southern limits. As Damian rightly wrote, we would not have gambled $250,000 laser scanning of a random stretch of forest in the hope that we might accidentally find a city lying on the forest floor. What the LiDAR technology allowed us was to see through the vegetation at an unprecedented level of detail, revealing the subtle landscape modification. Here, the skeleton of this over 40 square kilometer organized geometrically and orientated city, where most civil construction were built in perishable material, or there, and you have seen this image, its impressive mountain temple. Knowing the presence of Mahendra Parvata was one thing, but being able to see it was the real discovery. The sites we knew were now integrated into a urban grid, offering evidence that the Khmer had a comprehensive understanding of this undulating topography at a landscape scale. Many others were unknown and appeared with the LiDAR. This, of course, completely reoriented our strategy. For the next 5 years, we had field verification and travel excavation focusing on these revealed features, such as the dikes, the plots aligned along the axis of this urban framework, the ponds, the canals, quarries, and the surprising later mounds. LiDAR showed that the reservoir dikes were part of this 9th century network. It also revealed the settlements of its population. It determined the third major and missing component of this capital, its Barai, as well as its spatial relationship with the mountain temple. It confirmed the use of a later canal, redirecting water to the quarries of the Angkor monument, and corroborated the concentration of later sites disconnected from this urban network. In conclusion, this led to a series of publications summarizing the previous researches and, of course, this spectacular progress on understanding this site. LiDAR being also used in other major Khmer sites under Damian leadership, it allows us to place Mahendra Parvata, this ambitious 9th century urban planning, into the pre-Angkorian and Angkorian urban forms developments, thus deconstructing both myth of the lost city and the birthplace of the Khmer Empire. Damian Evans introduced the use of the LiDAR technology. Introducing the use of the LiDAR technology has brought an unprecedented dynamic to the archaeology of landscape in Southeast Asia. It is still ongoing nowadays with the Archaeoscape project in Thailand and Indonesia, as Christophe was mentioning, and we owe him not only a tool, but a new vision over centuries of landscape modification, from the slightest terrain signatures to the major urban systems. To conclude on a more specific note, and as we all appreciate the importance of a free press, it is necessary to remember that decades of archaeological research and its intricacies, suddenly accelerated by the latest technological improvement, can, if not carefully highlighted and explained, fall into sensationalism and lead to misinformation. Thank you very much.
Jean-Baptiste, thank you very much. I think that showed wonderfully how this new stuff is set into a background that goes back a long way and was already very solid, and the new technology has brought something very special. The fourth speaker is Mitch Hendrickson, please.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to those people also watching online. What I'm going to talk about, it's nice, so you've been introduced to what Damian did, so there's going to be some repetitive stuff. We'll have a quiz on it later. But what I wanted to start off with is sort of the archaeological perspectives. I'm going to talk about perspectives and impacts in relationship to Damian. So if you look at the speakers today, all of us, we dig. Archaeologists are known for digging. And Damian, however, is very famous for saying this: I don't dig. So he looks up, but we look down, which leads us to the idea of what does landscape archaeology really do for us? And so the interesting thing that's happened, and I think this is what Christophe pointed out and also Jibé, is that there's been a transformation in the study of Angkor over the past. I mean, research has been going on for over a century. The traditional view is to look at it at the temple, right? What happens at the temple? But what happens if we move above and beyond that to looking at the temple in space? And I think it's pretty clear that what we get is different perspectives on things like infrastructure organization, settlement patterns, and environmental relationships, but beyond these individual sites. So from my perspective, working with Damian since 2003, he always also looked down. And in fact, I was looking at photographs of him because he and I wandered around the landscape for a long time, and he's always looking down. Like literally every photograph I have of him is looking at that Palm Pilot or notebook, and it became a GPS unit, locating sites, and also making sure you know where you are. Of course, out in the landscape, you need to make sure you can find yourself, as well as being able to tell people that there was a temple over there. But also a perspective from an archaeologist such as myself, I always found that I was kind of always behind him. The other photographs I have is him in front of me. Maybe it's because he was actually so excited to get to the temple in the landscape that I end up with these pictures of him like, hey, hold on, wait. So in many ways, he was leading the way, and in fact, he was leading the way in the fact that many of you may not know this, but his was the first English language PhD on archaeology in the Khmer world. I was second, 3 minutes behind him. Not that I'm holding a grudge, but the point is, this sort of set the path for him moving forward. We already know the map. You're going to see lots and lots of pictures of this. You have already. I have to give a shout out to the person who started the map, who's sitting right here, in terms of its most recent form, Christoph. And Christoph met Roland Fletcher, and I chose this photograph. I was going to pick a real one, but someone did this amazing caricature of him, and I thought, that's great. So Roland, if you're watching, this is awesome. And then, so Roland and Christoph started talking together, and they brought together this undergraduate student, Damian Evans, who completed the top part. And yes, I may have not got the actual dimensions of those boxes correct, but you get the point. So that was his first initial impact, was to fill in that top box and to start digitalizing everything, which led to his growing impact, which was about creating this notion of what has become through the University of Sydney and the Greater Angkor project and the map of Greater Angkor. So you have this massive complex of infrastructure, sites, landscape, etc. Led to the big publication and all the hoopla that began all this in 2007, I think. The comprehensive archaeological map of the largest pre-industrial settlement complex. All these big words, there's a lot of wonderful things that came out of this. If you look at his impacts on Google Scholar, this is the easiest way. I was going to look at his CV. I'm like, the digital world does this for me. You can see he's got over 80 publications, dozens and dozens of collaborators. And the neat thing, though, is that he published on a wide range of things. So the dynamics of Angkor and its landscape, theoretically. He talked about things, again, theoretically, on the management of water networks. He talked about the actual method of using airborne laser scanning or lidar to look at long-term socio-ecological dynamics. He looked at their implications for global tropical forests. And then he also wrote a publication on the ethics of using archaeological lidar that I think everyone should probably read. What is the implications of the creation of these data sets, who gets access to them, and how are they used? So he has a huge range of things besides the map. If you look at his impacts on Angkorian civilization more broadly, he was, of course, brought on by Michael Coe to do the second edition of Angkor and the Khmer Civilization in 2018. And then he worked with Miriam Stark and I, on the publication of the Angkorian World, which I had to take over for him when he was identified with cancer. And so this was his big contribution, and he put a huge stamp on that book, and we're really, really proud of it. Moving beyond that, he did a museum exhibit and IMAX film in terms of the Angkor and the Lost Empire of Cambodia that he was part of. So his reach is actually beyond academia. Now, the title of my paper, though, is to look at the research beyond Angkor. If we look at the lidar acquisitions, there's a growing scale from Kalk to Cali and the EFEO. And then more recently, he's done Sukhothai, is going to Indonesia with a grand total of 6,730 kilometers squared, which I think might be the single largest acquisition by one scholar and colleagues in the world. There's a sort of contest between Mesoamerica that's going on. But what you can see is he's done all these other sites outside of Angkor. If you look at the impacts, his research going before the actual lidar acquisition, he did a paper on Khmer, remapped the site, and through this found evidence of quarries used for actually the production of various monuments at the site. He also identified features related to water management and collapse. He had this using that map, he would go off into the bush and found this huge spillway in the forest that eventually turned in, identified through these laterite blocks, that turned into this major dam that was really critical in holding water at Khmer, and identified that the collapse of this very feature may have led to the collapse of Khmer as a capital in the 10th century. He also did the lidar at Bente Chmar, which again, there's been lots of researchers, colleagues of ours from APSR and the Ministry of Culture, had been working in the landscape, identifying things, but as Jupé's pointed out, the lidar just made it easier to see things. So for instance, the canals that connect Bente Chmar both to the north and to the south, which themselves connect to different sandstone quarries and laterite quarries that were likely used for the production of those sites. This is actually also instrumental, I think, in the application process for Bente Chmar to become a World Heritage Site. So really important stuff. If you look at the nature of impact from a sort of thematic perspective, urban form, at Angkor we saw that there's this beautiful grid inside of Angkor Wat. These orthogonal grid enclosures are found all over the place. So 12th, 13th century, there's Bente Chmar and Beng Melia, and they also found them at the site that I work at, which is Prayakan of Kampong Svai, which is 100 kilometers to the east of Angkor. Prayakan is a very fascinating site. I've had 2 different projects working there since 2009. It's 4 concentric enclosures. It's got this weird orientation. It's connected to Angkor and by a road, but not only one, but 2 different types of rest houses. It's 30 kilometers away from the single largest iron source, where there's tons and tons of iron production that I've been studying for years as well. And it's the only site with internal evidence of iron smelting. However, this site is also really heavily looted from the 80s and 90s, so it's hard to find a really good place to understand what's underneath the ground. In terms of the nature of mapping, because that's what Damian's really good at, we can see the evolution from the Delaport mission in Emonier to Moget in 1939, which was the last map that was made up until we started our project. So kind of a nice skeleton framework of this very fascinating site that's nearly 5 kilometers by 5 kilometers in area. This is my map. I thought I can do this too. Damian sits in an office nearby me. So I got myself some remote sensing data, not quite AirSAR, not quite anything that expensive. I went kind of low tech. And this is what I made, which, you know, I thought was pretty decent. I did some excavations. This is again, it's very simple, isn't it? And what you can see here are the distribution of the temples, which were known, of course, in a linear direction, southwest and northeast. But all those little red dots are iron production sites. And so we excavated them, and we found that they're situated on trapyangs, the water tanks, and they're fairly small. And all the ones we had were actually not Angkorian, really. They're kind of post-Angkorian, which is interesting, but not kind of part of the story that I wanted to address. So I decided, hey, Damian, could you help me remap this? Because I think I'm missing something. So these little yellow lines are all the places we used to wander around the landscape together, finding sites. And of course, you have to go on the ground to ground truth these things. And so we produced our final map in 2015 through this paper. And what we identified was a series of a few kind of brick temples that have been disassembled, and some sites in and around the outside of the big wall, but kind of not really that much. It was satisfying and yet not satisfying. So that was a bit of a frustration. However, what we did find is, why was it aligned that way? So if you take the DEM and look at it, and what's interesting is that there's Damian for scale up against the outside wall, and you can see it's actually a double moat, triple embanked wall, which obviously is probably some kind of water management. Contrary to Moget, it's not complete. It's actually 2 brackets, which is interesting. And what we figured out is that the orientation is actually perpendicular to the way the water flows. So once again, the ancient Khmer were actually really good at understanding how water was managed. However, an Italian colleague has also posited that there is a correlation with potentially this was aligned to the full moon. And I'm beginning to see there may be a little combination of these 2 things, which are interrelated with the Buddhist history of this site. So let's get to the lidar. Of course, that happened in 2015. This is what it looked like This is, if you can kind of see the DEM over of the LiDAR from the Cali mission, and these are the kind of things that we found. If you look at the sort of urban similarities, we found again these really kind of comparable features to what you get in Angkor Wat in terms of a gridded enclosure, and you can see in those circles you have the weird geometric features, which I think we're still trying to figure out what those are. But there's only a few places in the Angkorian world that have these things, Angkor and Prayakan of Kampong Svai, which suggests they're equally important. From a practical impact at Prayakan, is how to avoid the looting pits. If I wanted, so you see a little dots there, that's where everything was looted, and probably more. Before the LiDAR, I would go around with the GPS, and I would take a point every time I hit a looting pit, and I stopped at 1,000 because I just couldn't do any more. So what's great is that the LiDAR allowed us to eventually look at the entire landscape to figure out where we could dig that would actually have a place that's undisturbed. And so we found in Block 10 a place that was relatively ideal for this excavation to figure out who was living in this site. And so what we found was definitely a house. In Trench 7, we found evidence of all the different types of Khmer glazed stonewares, which means that they're interacting with all the local trade networks. We found all the Chinese ceramics that you would expect imported into Angkor. We have domesticated rice, Indian mung bean, weeds and cultivation, which means they're doing all the same things that you have at Angkor 100 kilometers away. And we also found what we call a hoard of Chinese coins, which is 4. That date between the Tang and the Song dynasty, which is part of the push out of this money. The interesting thing, though, is that these coins are typically only found in ritual context everywhere else, but here they're in a settlement. So what were they used for? We're publishing a paper on that soon. So the LiDAR revealed that. It also helped me find the sort of, that golden nugget of where the heck is the Angkorian iron production sites. So I had walked around the landscape and I found these ones and dated them, and they didn't match up to the Angkorian period. The LiDAR comes along, and now you're going to understand how to read LiDAR by the end of tonight. This is where they are. There's these mounds all on this ridge, and they all date to the 11th to 13th century and were probably used for iron production at the time of the construction, or at least to produce tools for the occupants of the site. So in terms of the impact above and beyond, one of the things I also wanted to talk about is collaboration. He was extremely generous with his time, with his LiDAR data, and we owe an immense amount to him because essentially his work is providing a legacy for generations to come. I'm really sorry. He was an incredible scholar. We'll miss him immensely, and I hope the next 25 years of people will benefit from the work that he did. Thank you very much.
Mitch, thank you very much indeed. The last speaker is Martin Polkinghorne, please.
Thank you. I'm just a little bit taller. I need to adjust the microphone here. I'd like to thank the Siam Society and the FEO for inviting me to this important event. Also Chris Baker for chairing, and Christophe Potier, and also a special shout out to Mitch just then. In fact, our presentations are funnily similar. In fact, we didn't chat about them beforehand, but perhaps we should have. So my name's Martin Polkinghorne. I was lucky enough to call Damian a friend and a colleague for over 2 decades. Our paths converged at the University of Sydney when we were both enrolled in PhDs under the supervision of Professor Roland Fletcher. I vividly remember our first meeting in 2002. Instantly, this was in the University Quadrangle of the University of Sydney. Instantly, Damian and I started to exchange experiences and knowledge with him actually helping me to question some dubious claims about the original unit of measurement of Angkor Wat. Something that I want to emphasise, which I think you can see already and that Mitch covered here, is that Damian's collegiality brought people together. In the beginning of the Greater Angkor project, there was a small cohort of passionate postgraduate students that included Mitch, Eileen Lustig, and myself. And this could have easily become petty and competitive. Competition between students, particularly at the PhD level, is very common, but it was never that way with Damian. Unlike many academics who covet information, he chose to openly share his knowledge. The result of that was the sum of the whole is greater than the parts. I was never under any illusions about the comparative significance of our PhD work. Even in 2002, Damian was destined to change how we understand Angkor. From about 2003, our summers were filled with each other's company during the Greater Angkor project field seasons. And our bonds deepened between 2009 and 2014 when we shared an office and the responsibilities of managing the University of Sydney Research Centre in Siem Reap, along with Dr. Georgina Lloyd, who's also here tonight. This evening, I'd like to briefly highlight part of Damian's contributions to understanding the archaeological landscapes of the period after Angkor. So thus far we've been talking about the Angkorian period, but I'd like to specifically talk about the 16th and 17th century capital of Longbek. Now, his insightful intuition on this matter, like many of his ideas, proved to be remarkably accurate. Now, my first visit to Longbek was in 2009, when he was assisting another colleague, Gabrielle Ewington, with her survey work, and this was a follow-up to her groundbreaking honours thesis on the post-Angkorian period, which had been really the first archaeological study on these sites and this period for nearly 30 years. At that time, I was interning at the National Museum of Cambodia, a great time in my life, a great privilege to be a volunteer at that museum, assisting with curatorial tasks. And I rode up to Longbek on a motorbike from Phnom Penh to meet Damian and Gabby. We spent the day conducting site visits, including visiting the enclosure wall pictured here. You can see Damian looking down again at his tablet GPS. Look, I didn't know then that I'd have the privilege of excavating at this very enclosure. As I mentioned, Damian and I shared an office from 2009, and we'd often talk about the period after Angkor. So under his direction, it was a great honour that we could include a lidar survey of Longbek, Udong area in the second lidar campaign of 2015. In an overview article about the 2015 survey, Damian published preliminary observations about Longbek in the Journal of Archaeological Science. Now, in contrast to Angkor, there have been comparatively few archaeological studies of the period after Angkor. Damian and Gabby Ewington had already recognised there was much more there. Of course, this had been known to Cambodian scholars for generations. The site of Longbek has a series of earthen embankments that form a 7 square kilometre rectilinear citadel against a natural barrier of flooded paddy and the Tonle Sap River to the east. The character of Longbek was unknown before Damian's lidar. Upon joining the archaeology discipline at Flinders University, I initiated a new collaboration between the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts and the Nara National Research Institute for Cultural Properties of Japan, and we began a new program of excavations at Longbek. At first, I disagreed with Damian's initial interpretation of the site, Now, 8 years later, I must acknowledge that his interpretations were correct, as confirmed by ground verification. After the 2015 lidar survey, Damian proposed that Long Vec was relatively empty of occupation, especially when compared to the 12th to 13th century enclosure of Angkor Thom. This slide produced by Damian illustrates a comparison of the urban core of Angkor, specifically Angkor Thom on the right, on the left, on your left, and Long Vec on the right. While the structures are similar in size, the population of Angkor appeared to exceed that at Long Vec by many orders of magnitude. While there were no conventional Angkorian type occupation mounds on the ground, my team, my collaborative team, saw the evidence of trade ceramics at Long Vec everywhere. Was this indicative of occupation? I, at the time, hypothesised that the landscape had been modified at a later date, and that at that later date, the landscape of occupation had been removed, in fact. Now, I'll describe now how I've come to agree with Damian's first interpretation. Now, using a combination of aerial remote sensing, not just LiDAR, but aerial photos as well, ground truthing, geophysical prospection, and excavations, our team has mapped the archaeological landscape of Long Vec and identified a range of religious foundations, occupation features, agricultural spaces, locations of craft production, roads, hydraulic infrastructure, and also specifically spaces indicative of commerce and trade. Like Angkor, Long Vec is a palimpsest. Damian hated that word, by the way, even though he said it many times. A palimpsest, when I say this, that is, there are multiple layers of occupation, and the landscape changes that overlap through time. So when you see an archaeological map of Long Vec or the other ones you've been looking at, Angkor Thom or Angkor, note that these are sites which have developed over more than a millennia. Now, to test the hypothesis of missing or modified occupation, over many years our collaborative team has conducted pedestrian survey and ceramic collection. We've surveyed more than 268 hectare grids with nearly 35,000 ceramic shards registered, of which 18,000 are imported ceramics. Now, trade ceramics are the most highly durable and portable, of which are blue and white porcelains, the most recognisable forms of early modern Southeast Asian trade. Now, there could be little doubt based on these ceramics that Long Vec was firmly connected to international trade. But what did these ceramics indicate? Did they indicate population? Now we argue they did not. But this still leaves the question about why was the citadel wall so large and when was it constructed? Only recently have we been able to interpret the construction of the citadel wall. It was specifically defensive, but it did not enclose a large urban area. Recalling the Cambodian mythology related to Long Vec, the most famous story declares that the king of Ayutthaya's first 16th century attempts of invasion were thwarted by a thick bamboo forest that protected the city. To give his army access to the citadel, the king of Ayutthaya shot silver coins into the forest. The Cambodian citizens of Long Vec cut down the forest to obtain the coins, and the Ayutthayans returned to capture the city. Now, while there remains much contemporary evidence of bamboo at Long Vec, we have found no similar evidence of silver coins. Nevertheless, we can now infer a date for the construction of the citadel, which was certainly a defensive structure with perhaps as many as 8 fortified bastions or forts along its north and western edges. Significantly, our excavations have discovered the remains of wooden palisades, which may have surrounded the entire enclosure. But when was it built? OSL dates from the bottom of the wall show quartz fractions were variously exposed to sunlight in the 14th and also the late 16th centuries. The southwest defensive bastion structure, however, offered radiocarbon ages from the late 16th century. Read together, we propose that the citadel was constructed in the late 16th century with reworked soil that was exposed to the sunlight in the 14th century. Notably, this discovery corresponds with additional lines of evidence regarding the war between Cambodia and Ayutthaya during this period, attested by the chronicles, inscriptions, and European reports. The Longvek citadel did not enclose high-density occupation. Instead, it mostly enclosed rice fields. And through the employ of Damian's lidar, we've been successful in mapping the contemporary rice fields. This work was done by my student, Dr. Belinda Duke, who I believe is also here. Although it requires additional demonstration, it's likely that these configurations of rice fields align with those made in antiquity. Damian was right, after all. And now we ask, was it also necessary for the Cambodian political authority to protect rice fields? You'll see the same point from Mitch here. Damian often ironically joked, I don't dig. Apparently he left the so-called dirty work to the rest of us. One of our collaborations to investigate an as yet really unintelligible landscape feature he termed a mound field, Jibei offered some photos of that, landed me in a trench for 6 weeks, and the sole find was one nondescript earthenware shirt. So maybe he was right about digging after all. Finally, I wish to reflect on a comment of one of our colleagues, Associate Professor Ellen Shea, at this week's Simeo SPAFA conference. I hope she will forgive me for repeating her comments, but they went something like this. I walked into the conference session and the first thing I saw was Damian's lidar. At the conference session I personally sat in yesterday for the entire day from 8:30 to 5 p.m. Perhaps as many as 80% of the presentations used Damian's work. That's his enduring scholarly influence today and into the future. My own sense of self is profoundly intertwined with the friendship we shared. We lived through some transformative years, the trials, the thrills of fieldwork, the achievements of our doctoral studies. His legacy of scholarship and especially collegiality will live on in all of those who called him a friend. Although Damian didn't dig, he wasn't a stranger to fieldwork, as you've seen in many of these photos, and he continued to conduct survey until he could not. This is how I will remember him in the field, excited to discover the cultural in the natural. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our speakers. Can we turn the lights up? Yeah. Okay. How long have we got? I'm not sure how long we've got. But please, if there are any questions, please raise your hand. We have some microphones. Maybe you could ask a question to any of the speakers or just make a comment, please. Please here.
Yes. So thank you for the presentations. I've been impressed by the results of the LiDAR campaign. And I have some question about planning these campaigns and about use of LiDAR. Can LiDAR be used during rainy season? And we have seen a chopper carrying a black equipment. I think this is LiDAR. So many elements have to be studied before planning LiDAR campaign. Which equipment, which helicopter, modifications to the helicopter to the structure, to the electric equipment. The pilot has to be trained, which altitude, which pattern, has some ability to follow a course. All these technical points, I think, are very important for the success of the campaign. So you may not answer all my questions, but to give importance to the preparation and the work on by your professors to achieve these wonderful results. Thank you.
I'm a bit shorter. Yes, thank you very much for your comment. You're totally right. Actually, there is a lot of planning behind this kind of acquisition, which is not only quite complex, but also quite expensive. So it's better not to fail it. Actually, it's not that I don't want to answer, but actually each campaign, each site is different. And we have been doing lidar in 2012. I told you we were just finishing an acquisition last Sunday. Sensors have been changing, GPS have been changing, helicopters, planes, UAV, drones are changing every day, I would say, or every year. So that depends. There is actually not only one solution, but there are different solutions which have always been to be adapted to the site, to the size of the site you are working with. There is, for instance, no reason to bring an helicopter or a plane if you are just interested in 1 or 2 hectares. On the other hand, if you want to cover 2,000 square kilometers, it's completely hopeless to do that with a drone. So it's a lot of calculation, adaptation. Adaptation also to the communities, to the national authorities. Each context is slightly different. So of course, and that's what one quality of Damian, who was the architect, the manager of the 2 main acquisitions in Cambodia in 2012 and 2015, was actually to design, to organize this campaign with all the different partners, including the company, the surveying company who was involved into doing this acquisition. So yeah, it's a quite complex level of preparation before, but it's largely worthwhile compared to what we can do with it later.
We have time for a couple. Please, over here.
Thank you. My question might be a little silly in the room of academics. I hear a lot of talk about looting, like a lot of sites were missing items. And I wonder if any other speaker could elaborate on that. Was the looting done many years ago before the vegetation covered up the sites? Were they done relatively recently? And if they were done relatively recently, given that I assume they don't have the technologies, how did they find the valuables at those sites? And what do they actually took? I assume they didn't took broken pottery. There must be something of significance. I wonder if someone could elaborate on the looting situation and what was likely missing. Thank you.
I can only speak to what we found at Prayacon. In talking with the locals, most of the looting was done between about 1987 and 1995, and it was hand excavation, and they found a lot of metal objects, a lot of bronze, and that was part of the impetus to, raise funds. And so there was bronze statues, bronze objects. A lot of the temples themselves were badly damaged. We're not sure exactly why the temple at Prayacon is so badly dismantled. There were stories that they were told there was gold in some of the sandstone blocks, and so they were broken. But from what we've found in the archaeological record in terms of the site that we excavated, because we found nothing, and at one point we're told metal detectors were used. We found very little metal, but the nature of the occupation in terms of the ceramics that were found indicates that the site was very wealthy, and there's evidence also of slags from bronze casting. So they were actually manufacturing the objects on site. So we're not really sure. There's teams now who are trying to get at what was actually taken. Obviously there's lots of beautiful sandstone statues and things that were badly damaged and shipped off as well. But in terms of the excavation, it was really finding metal objects, gold, and things like that, which will be obviously sold off into markets and won't be recoverable.
One more. Okay, here, please.
I'm just wondering if any of the speakers tonight are familiar with Professor Heng Tung. He passed away about 13, 14 years ago, but he was a very active geologist who worked on sensory imaging, and he was specifically interested in the Angkor area in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. I think he passed away in 2010. He worked with UNESCO and with SPAFA, and certainly I'm sure Damian would have known of him if he didn't actually meet him. He was, as a geologist, he wasn't a trained archaeologist, but he was extremely interested in geology, and passionate geologist, sort of an amateur geologist. He actually came up with a lot of interesting ideas about how Angkor declined, apart from the social and political reasons for it declining, but he came up with geological reasons for its decline based on the way the water and the landscape had changed, and they were not able to keep the water. And he showed with imagery, satellite imagery and infrared imagery, how they kept adding more dikes to try and save the water and keep the water and stop it escaping. So I'm just wondering if anybody has ever heard of him. Professor Heng Tung.
Yes, if I may, I'm not young enough to have met and to have worked with Heng Tung, who had a very interesting theory about the geological liftoff of the plate of the Angkor plain, which would explain some observation he made about the very strange river courses of the present rivers at that time. The lift up of the as a geologic cause of the changes of the riverine system in Angkor was a very interesting working hypothesis at that time, especially considering that we didn't really had huge cartographic data available over the area. Fortunately, since the 1990s, when he was active, when he came in Angkor, we now have new sets of data, of mapping, of maps, including the lidar, which clearly actually shows other explanation about the changes of the course of the rivers and so on. We may not really understand everything yet, but actually we can so far disclose this geological cause on such a small period of time. But I take the opportunity to mention his work because it was very interesting. He was one of the people who actually tried to understand Angkor not only as a series of temples, of monumental temples, but as with a larger scope, with the territory around and so on. And in that sense, I remember very interesting discussion with him. Thank you very much for raising his memory. Thank you.
We will unfortunately have to end it here. I would just like to say in finale, I think this is a fabulous story of a remarkable guy, some extraordinary new technology, and an amazing site coming together, which have over the space of not much more than a decade, changed the history of the world. Because there was no sense before all of this of how important and large and significant Angkor was, not just locally here, in the local context, but within a larger context of the history of human civilization. And to me, it's an amazing story. So I would like to thank very much Christophe, Per, Jean-Baptiste, Mitch, and Martin for taking the trouble to come here tonight to talk to us. Thank you very much. We have to give them a giftie.